The waiter's world crumbled in an instant. The young man he had dismissed, the one he deemed unworthy of his time, was about to become his boss. He had made a mistake, a catastrophic, career-ending mistake. Before a stunned, pale-faced waiter stood a well-dressed, powerful man, James Carter, who gestured to a teenager, Jaylen Carter, sitting at a poorly lit table in the corner. The man's voice, though calm, echoed with the finality of a judge's gavel. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story rewinds to 30 minutes earlier. The afternoon sun glinted off the polished chrome and sweeping curves of the Gilded Spoon, an upscale American diner that was a masterclass in nostalgic elegance. Its neon sign, a warm cursive glow even in the daylight, hummed a promise of timeless class. A row of expensive cars, German sedans and Italian sports cars, were parked neatly along the curb, their glossy paintwork reflecting the restaurant's prestige. It was a place that didn't just serve food, it served an image. A sleek, high-end electric scooter, silent as a whisper, glided to a stop by the bike rack, a stark contrast to the gas-guzzling luxury vehicles. From it dismounted Jaylen Carter, a handsome, athletic 17-year-old. Today was his 17th birthday, a milestone that came with the promise of a life-changing surprise from his father. He was dressed in what he considered his most comfortable, authentic self. A designer gray hoodie made of a soft, heavy cotton, a pair of clean, dark-washed jeans that fit perfectly, and on his feet, a pair of immaculate, limited-edition sneakers that sneakerheads would kill for. A mix of excitement for his father's mysterious gift and the familiar, weary apprehension of entering spaces like this alone churned in his gut. He took a moment, adjusting the strap of his backpack, and thought about the uniform. It was the unspoken dress code he'd learned to adopt over the years. The crisp, button-down shirt, the tailored chinos, the polished leather shoes, the expensive watch. It was the armor he wore to be taken seriously, to preemptively neutralize the assumptions that came with being a young black man in predominantly white, wealthy spaces. But today, on his birthday, he had deliberately left the armor at home. He was testing the world, and maybe a part of himself, to see if things were any different. He thought about his father's incredible journey, a man who had started with absolutely nothing, just a dream and an unbreakable work ethic, and had built this restaurant, this entire empire of them, from the ground up. Jaylen felt the immense weight of that legacy, a constant, quiet pressure to prove he was more than just the fortunate son, more than just a name on a future inheritance. He wanted to earn his place, not just be given it. With a deep breath, Jaylen pushed open the heavy glass door, a small bell chiming his arrival. The interior was even more impressive up close. The air was thick with the rich, comforting sense of sizzling steaks, freshly brewed coffee, and a faint, sweet hint of maple syrup. A low, pleasant hum of conversation filled the space, punctuated by the gentle clinking of silverware against ceramic plates. The hostess, a young woman with a tight blonde bun, was on the phone, her back to the door, so Jaylen waited patiently, his eyes scanning the room. He took in the plush red leather of the booths, the gleaming chrome fixtures, the black and white checkered floor that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a beautiful place, a testament to his father's vision. From across the dining room, Preston Wells, a waiter in his late 20s, spotted him. Preston had sharp, angular features and a practiced smile that he could switch on and off like a light bulb. His eyes, cold and appraising, swept over Jaylen in a single dismissive glance. They lingered on the gray hoodie, the casual jeans, the sneakers. The assessment was instantaneous and unflattering. He saw a kid who didn't belong. He saw someone who would probably order a single glass of water, nurse it for an hour to leech off the free Wi-Fi, and leave a crumpled $1 bill as a tip if he left one at all. A familiar bitterness curdled in Preston's stomach. He felt he deserved so much more than this, more than clearing plates and faking smiles for people he secretly believed he was smarter than. He was drowning in debt, a consequence of trying to maintain a lifestyle of fancy apartments and designer clothes that his waiter's salary could never support. His resentment simmered just below the surface of his polished veneer, always looking for a target. He decided in that split second that Jaylen Carter was not worth his time, his energy, or his practiced, insincere charm. He was a waste of a table. Just then the hostess hung up the phone and turned, her professional smile ready. "Hi," Welcome to the Gilded Spoon. Table 4, she began, her eyes landing on Jaylen. Before she could finish, Preston was there, smoothly intercepting her. I'll handle this, he said. Not to Jaylen, but to her, with a small, dismissive wave of his hand. The hostess, taken aback by his abruptness, simply nodded and retreated to her station. Preston then turned his attention to Jaylen, his smile finally appearing, though it was a thin, brittle thing that didn't come close to reaching his eyes. Just one? He asked, his tone clipped and impatient. He didn't wait for Jaylen to respond. He snatched a single menu from the hostess stand and spun on his heel. This way, he commanded, his voice flat. He led Jaylen not towards one of the many empty, comfortable booths that lined the walls, but towards the back of the restaurant. He walked him past the gleaming bar, past tables of laughing families and couples, to a small, sad-looking two-top table crammed into a forgotten corner. It was wedged between the swinging doors of the noisy, clattering kitchen and a drafty service corridor where staff bustled back and forth. It was, without a doubt, the worst table in the entire establishment. This is all we have available right now, Preston lied, his voice a smooth, oily slick of practiced deceit. He gestured to the cramped table as if presenting a royal throne. Jaylen's gaze drifted over to 3 pristine, empty booths, all cleaned and set, waiting for guests. He looked back at the waiter, his expression calm and polite. I see a few empty booths over there, he said, his voice even. Could I possibly sit in one of those? Preston let out a short, humorless laugh, a puff of air that was pure condescension. Those are reserved, he said, his eyes glinting with a mean-spirited satisfaction. For our priority guests. I'm sure you understand. The words, though spoken softly, landed like a slap. Jaylen felt a familiar stinging sensation, the 1000th paper cut of casual, dismissive racism. It wasn't a shouted slur or an overt act of aggression. It was a quiet, insidious judgment. A dismissal of his worth based on a glance, a hoodie, and the color of his skin. A hot surge of anger flared in his chest, but he quickly suppressed it, his father's voice echoing in his mind from 100 different lectures. Asterisk, never let them see you lose your cool, son. Anger is a weapon they can use against you. Observe, learn. And then, when the time is right, act from a position of power. Asterisk. He unclenched his fists, his jaw tight. He would not give this man the satisfaction of a reaction. He would play the long game. With a single, almost imperceptible nod, Jaylen slid into the chair at the undesirable table. The draft from the corridor was immediate, a cool stream of air that made him instinctively pull his hoodie tighter. The game, he thought, had just begun. 10 minutes passed. To Jaylen, they felt like an eternity, each second stretching into a long, drawn-out insult. The clatter of pans from the kitchen, the sharp hiss of the grill, the murmur of conversations around him, all seemed to amplify the silence at his own table. Preston walked past him no fewer than half a dozen times. He never once glanced in Jaylen's direction. It was a masterclass in deliberate ignorance, an art form of making someone feel invisible. Preston moved with a self-important bustle, his chin held high, his path weaving through the dining room in a way that always managed to keep his back to Jaylen's corner. His attention was focused entirely elsewhere. At a nearby booth, a man in a crisp, expensive suit and a woman dripping with delicate gold jewelry were laughing at something Preston had said. The waiter was a different person with them. He was animated, charming, his smile wide and genuine, or at least a convincing imitation of it. He leaned in conspiratorially as he refilled their water glasses from a chilled glass bottle, his movements a flourish of practiced elegance. He laughed loudly, a booming, obsequious sound, at a joke the man made, patting his own chest as if he'd been genuinely winded by the humor. He was a performer, and this couple was his adoring audience. Jaylen felt the initial sting of anger begin to cool, replaced by something else, something sharper and more focused. He stopped feeling like a victim and started thinking like an owner. His father had always told him that the best way to understand a business was to watch it when it thought no one important was looking. And so, Jaylen watched. He saw Preston's inefficient movements, how he took the longest possible route back to the kitchen after schmoozing with the couple, bypassing two other tables that had their menus closed and were clearly ready to order. He saw how Preston failed to notice an elderly man at another table trying to get his attention, his hand raised politely for what seemed like a full minute before it dropped in resignation. Jaylen's frustration, once a hot, personal feeling, was now channeling itself into a sharp, critical assessment of the restaurant's operations. He was seeing the flaws in the system his father had so meticulously built, flaws that were being exploited and widened by employees like Preston. This wasn't just a waiter being a jerk, this was a breakdown in quality control. This was a threat to the brand. Seated at a prime booth across the room was Mrs. Gable, an elegant woman in her late 60s with a cascade of silver hair pinned perfectly in place. She was a well-known regular, a woman who had been coming to the Gilded Spoon since it first opened its doors. Her late husband had been one of James Carter's first investors. She was observant and fiercely intelligent, and she missed very little. Her keen eyes, framed by stylish glasses, had noted Jaylen's arrival. She had seen Preston's dismissive gesture, the walk to the worst table in the house, and the subsequent, pointed ignorance. She watched the scene unfold with a neutral but discerning expression, her lips pressed into a thin, thoughtful line. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, her gaze flickering from the fawning Preston to the patient, watchful teenager in the corner. Jaylen's mind drifted to the training programs his father had personally designed. He could almost hear his dad's voice during one of the mandatory all-staff meetings he'd been allowed to sit in on. Dignity and respect, his father had boomed, his voice filling the room. Those are the two pillars of our service. I don't care if someone walks in wearing a three-piece suit or a potato sack. I don't care if they order the most expensive steak on the menu or a single cup of coffee. Every single person who walks through that door is a guest in our house, and they will be treated with the same level of respect. No exceptions. Jaylen looked at Preston, who was now wiping down an already pristine counter, and saw the living, breathing embodiment of everything his father despised in the service industry. This wasn't just a personal slight anymore, it was a fundamental betrayal of the company's core principles. It was a rot that, if left unchecked, could poison the entire enterprise. Steeling himself, Jaylen decided to force the issue. He waited for a moment when Preston was turned partially towards him and raised a hand slightly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and clear, loud enough to carry but not so loud as to cause a scene. For a split second, he saw a flicker of acknowledgement in Preston's eyes. The waiter had heard him. But then, in a movement that was both fluid and insulting, Preston turned his back completely and began polishing a wine glass that was already sparkling under the recessed lighting. He held it up, inspecting it for smudges that weren't there, the picture of diligent work, all while actively ignoring the customer behind him. A younger busboy, a teenager named Leo with a nervous energy and a face full of acne, noticed Jaylen's attempt. He saw the ignored hand, heard the polite request. He put down the tub of dirty dishes he was carrying and took a hesitant step towards Jaylen's table, his expression one of genuine willingness to help. Before he could take a second step, Preston's head snapped in his direction. He didn't say a word, but the glare he shot the busboy was venomous. It was a look that promised retribution, a silent threat that was crystal clear in the hierarchy of the restaurant staff. Leo froze in his tracks, his face paling. He gave Jaylen a quick, apologetic glance before grabbing his tub of dishes and scurrying away towards the kitchen, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The message was clear. This table was Preston's, and no one was to interfere. Finally, after another long minute, Preston seemed to decide that the nuisance in the corner needed to be dealt with. He let out an exaggerated, impatient sigh that was audible from 3 tables away, placed the polished glass back on its rack, and ambled over. He didn't approach with a notepad and pen, ready to take an order. He stopped a few feet from the table, crossing his arms over his chest, his posture radiating contempt. "Have you decided?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or are you still enjoying the view?" He gestured vaguely towards the swinging kitchen doors. Jaylen looked up, his expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge the sarcasm. He didn't react to the blatant hostility. He simply stated a fact. "I haven't been given a menu yet," he said, his voice perfectly level. The simple, true statement seemed to momentarily throw Preston off his rhythm. He had expected anger, frustration, maybe a complaint he could then use as a pretext to escalate the situation. He hadn't expected calm, quiet logic. He recovered quickly, his lips pulling back into a smirk. He feigned a moment of theatrical surprise, placing a hand over his heart. "Oh, my apologies," he said, his voice oozing insincerity. "It must have slipped my mind. With all our priority guests here today, you understand." He let the insult hang in the air for a moment before turning away. "I'll be right back." He didn't go to the hostess stand where the pristine, leather-bound menus were kept. Instead, he walked to a small, cluttered side station near the kitchen, a place where staff dumped their aprons and stored spare cutlery. He rummaged around for a moment before pulling out a menu. It was not like the one he had given the couple in the booth. This one was made of a cheaper, laminated paper. Its corners were soft and dog-eared from overuse. A dark, greasy stain marred the page with the appetizers, and the dessert section had a long, dried streak of what looked suspiciously like chocolate syrup. He walked back to Jaylen's table, holding the stained menu between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were a dirty rag. Without a word, without even making eye contact, he dropped it onto the table. It landed with a flat, dismissive thud, skidding a few inches before coming to a stop. The disrespect was now undeniable. It was no longer a subtle undercurrent, it was a tidal wave. This wasn't negligence, it was a calculated act of humiliation, a series of deliberate choices designed to make him feel small and unwelcome. Jaylen stared at the stained menu, at the greasy fingerprint on its cover. The last vestiges of his personal anger evaporated, replaced by a strange and profound sense of calm. The game had changed. This was no longer about him trying to get a meal. This was about justice. This was about a lesson that needed to be taught. He felt a strange sense of clarity settle over him, a cold, hard resolve that felt more powerful than any fleeting emotion. Preston had made his move, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. Jaylen hadn't just been observing a flawed employee, he had been presiding over a trial, and the verdict was in. Jaylen decided to conduct one final test, a definitive experiment to confirm the depth of the waiter's prejudice. He let another 5 minutes tick by, each one a silent, deliberate second hand sweeping across the face of a clock, marking the passage of time that Preston so clearly felt was being wasted. He watched the waiter, Preston, as he concluded a long and painfully sycophantic conversation with Mrs. Gable. From Jaylen's vantage point across the bustling dining room, he could see that the elegant older woman was far from charmed by the waiter's oily flattery. Her responses were brief, her smile was a tight, polite mask, and her eyes held a coolly analytical glint that Preston, in his self-congratulatory bubble, completely failed to notice. He was basking in the glow of his own perceived charm, convinced he had won over another wealthy patron who would surely reward his magnificent presence. Finally, with a sense of grim resolution, Jaylen closed the stained, dog-eared menu. The soft, dull thud of the laminated pages coming together was not loud, but in the small, tense space between him and the waiter's awareness, it felt as final as a gavel's strike. He placed the menu neatly at the edge of the table, a clear and universally understood signal in any restaurant, a silent summons. Preston, having just extracted a verbal promise of a very generous tip for your excellent service from the man in the expensive suit, felt practically invincible. His chest was puffed out with a toxic mixture of arrogance and relief, his steps carrying a swagger that was almost comical. The validation from that table had washed away the sting of his mounting credit card debt, at least for the moment. He saw the closed menu in the forgotten corner of his section and viewed it not as a customer's request for service, but as a final, irritating piece of trash he needed to sweep out of his establishment. He had tolerated the kid's presence long enough. It was time to take out the garbage. He approached the table with a look of grim finality, his already thin patience having been shredded into non-existence. "Are you ready to order or not?" Preston said, his voice a low, menacing growl that was carefully calibrated to be heard only by Jaylen. He leaned forward slightly, a deliberate act of physical intimidation, invading Jaylen's personal space with the stale scent of cheap cologne and resentment. "Some of us are trying to run a business here." Jaylen didn't lean back. He didn't shrink away from the waiter's aggressive posture. He held his ground, his spine straight, his gaze calm and unwavering as it locked with Preston's. The contrast between the two was stark. The waiter's barely concealed fury crashing against the teenager's wall of placid composure. "I'll just have a glass of water for now, please," Jaylen said, his voice perfectly steady, betraying no hint of fear or anger. He delivered the line with a quiet simplicity that was more powerful than any shout. "I'm waiting for someone." This was it. This was the final straw, the single snowflake that triggers the avalanche in Preston's mind. The sheer, unmitigated, unbelievable audacity of it. This kid, this nobody in a hoodie who had been a thorn in his side for the better part of an hour, had wasted his time, occupied a potentially profitable table during a busy lunch rush, and now, after all that, had the gall to order just a glass of water. The image of a $0 tip, a blank space on a credit card slip, flashed in Preston's mind, a crimson flag of pure, unadulterated rage. All his financial anxieties, his feelings of inadequacy, his bitterness towards the wealthy patrons he simultaneously envied and despised, all of it coalesced into a single point of white-hot fury directed at the calm teenager sitting before him. "Listen, kid." Preston leaned in closer, his face now just inches from Jaylen's, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that was far more threatening than any shout could ever be. "This isn't a youth hostel. This is a high-class establishment, a respected diner. Either you order a full meal, a real meal with an appetizer and an entree, right now, or you can take your glass of water and wait for your someone on the sidewalk outside. We have a reputation to maintain, and it doesn't include loiterers." The threat hung in the air between them, thick and ugly with malice. The open hostility, the undisguised contempt, the final, unequivocal message that Jaylen Carter did not belong here. Jaylen didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't even blink. He simply held the waiter's furious gaze for a long, pregnant moment, letting the silence stretch and amplify the ugliness of the words just spoken. Then, slowly, with a deliberate, unhurried grace that seemed to infuriate Preston even more, he reached into the pocket of his designer jeans. For a fleeting, hopeful second, Preston thought he was reaching for a wallet, perhaps finally intimidated into ordering the most expensive item on the menu. He was wrong. Instead, Jaylen pulled out the latest model smartphone, its dark glass screen gleaming under the dim lighting of the corner. His thumb moved calmly and methodically across the glass, his fingers steady, a stark contrast to the trembling rage that was causing a vein to pulse in Preston's temple. He typed out a short, simple message, the soft, almost inaudible taps of his thumb on the screen, the only sound in their bubble of confrontation. He hit send, the message disappearing into the ether. It read, "Ready when you are. Happy birthday to me." He then placed the phone face down on the table, the black rectangle a modern monolith of judgment. He folded his hands calmly on the table in front of him, looked directly into Preston's confused and angry eyes, and waited. A minute passed. It was perhaps the longest minute of Preston's life. It was a minute filled with the normal ambient sounds of the diner, the clinking of forks against plates, the low hum of a dozen conversations, the distant sizzle from the kitchen. But for the two of them at the table, it was a pocket of charged, deafening silence. Preston's face was a confused mask of impatience and indignation. He didn't understand what had just happened. Was the kid calling his bluff? Was he texting his friends to come and cause a scene? He was about to speak again, to repeat his threat, to tell the kid to get out once and for all, when the front door of the Gilded Spoon opened once more. The small bell chimed, but this time, its sound seemed to cut through the diner's noise with a different sort of resonance. Sharper, more significant. The energy in the entire room subtly shifted, a ripple moving outwards from the entrance, a collective, subconscious recognition of importance. The person who entered was not just another customer. He carried with him an aura of quiet, unshakable authority, a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. It was James Carter. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that fit him like a second skin, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his salt and pepper hair neatly styled. He looked every bit the successful, powerful magnate he was, a man comfortable with his own power. The hostess's eyes widened in stunned recognition, and she immediately shot up from her stool, her posture suddenly ramrod straight, as if the owner's presence had sent a jolt of electricity up her spine. "Mr. Carter," she stammered, a nervous blush rising on her cheeks as she fumbled with a stack of menus. We weren't expecting you, sir." Preston saw James Carter, and his mind, a frantic, desperate calculator of opportunity and social climbing, went into overdrive. All thoughts of the annoying kid in the corner, the threat, the glass of water, all of it evaporated like steam from a hot plate. This was it. This was the moment. His chance. The owner. The big boss. The man who held the keys to the entire kingdom. The man who could pluck him from this life of servitude and place him on a throne of management. If he could impress Mr. Carter, if he could show him what a dedicated, attentive, and charmingly professional waiter he was, a promotion was not just possible, it was practically guaranteed. He could be a manager, maybe even a regional director one day. He could finally pay off his debts, buy the car he wanted, and look down on the very people he was forced to serve. He abandoned all pretense of caring about any other table, his focus narrowing to a single brilliant point of light, the man standing at the door. He quickly, almost frantically, smoothed down the front of his apron with sweaty palms, a gesture that was meant to look professional but came across as nervous and jerky. He straightened his tie, which suddenly felt too tight around his neck. He took a deep breath and plastered on his widest, most dazzling, most sycophantic smile, a grotesque caricature of genuine warmth. He was a shark that had scented blood in the water, a famished wolf that had spotted the alpha of a rival pack. He prepared to intercept him, to be the first one to greet him, to make the singular impression that would change his entire life. He saw his future, bright and shiny, standing just a few feet away, and he was going to seize it, no matter who he had to step over to get there. With the single-minded focus of a predator, Preston practically sprinted towards the front of the diner, his polished shoes squeaking slightly on the checkered floor. He moved with an unseemly haste, cutting off the flustered hostess before she could even finish her stammered greeting to the owner. He arrived before James Carter, slightly out of breath, his face stretched into a wide, manic grin that looked more painful than pleasant. "Mr. Carter," he gushed, his voice an octave higher than usual, a saccharine torrent of manufactured delight. "What an absolute honor to have you here personally. We weren't expecting you, sir. A true surprise." He made a grand sweeping gesture with his arm, nearly knocking over a salt shaker from a nearby table. "Right this way, sir, please. I have your favorite booth, the corner one with the best view, ready and waiting just for you." He gestured towards the plushest, most exclusive booth in the entire restaurant, a semicircular haven of deep red leather that was currently, and pointedly, unoccupied. It was the throne room of the Gilded Spoon, and Preston was offering himself up as the kingmaker. James Carter's gaze fell upon the gushing waiter. He gave Preston a brief, unreadable look, his eyes calm and steady, betraying no emotion at all. There was no warmth in his expression, but no anger either. It was a look of pure, neutral assessment, the kind a geologist might give a common rock, and it was more unnerving than any scowl could ever be. "Thank you," James said, his voice a polite but firm baritone that carried an implicit note of dismissal. "But I'm here to meet someone." His eyes, sharp and intelligent, lifted from Preston and began to scan the dining room. The waiter's fawning smile faltered for a fraction of a second. James's gaze swept past the wealthy couple Preston had been fawning over, their importance dissolving under the owner's indifferent glance. His eyes passed over families laughing, business partners deep in discussion, and the elegant Mrs. Gable, to whom he gave the slightest, most respectful nod of acknowledgement. A gesture she returned with a knowing look of her own. His eyes continued their search, passing over every person Preston would have considered a priority guest. Then they stopped. Across the room, past the gleaming chrome and bustling staff, his gaze locked onto the small, a forgotten table crammed by the noisy kitchen doors and the drafty service corridor. And as his eyes found their target, a warm, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his stern, powerful features into those of a proud father. Preston's mind stuttered, unable to process what he was seeing. He followed Mr. Carter's line of sight, his own eyes landing on the kid in the hoodie. It made no sense. It was impossible. He felt a confused, sputtering rise in his throat, a jumble of half-formed questions and protests that died before they could become words. Ignoring the waiter's complete and utter bewilderment, James Carter began to walk. He moved with a quiet, unhurried purpose, his tailored suit jacket shifting with the confident stride of a man who owned every inch of the ground he walked on. He cut a path directly through the center of the restaurant, and as he moved, a hush fell over the tables nearest him. Patrons paused, forks halfway to their mouths, their conversations tapering off into whispers. They watched the owner, the legend, the man whose name was synonymous with quality and success, as he walked not to the best table, but towards the very worst. They wondered who it could possibly be, who this important man was going to meet in such a dismal corner. A sick, churning feeling began to bubble up from the pit of Preston's stomach, a cold, greasy dread that coated his insides. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, following a few paces behind James Carter like a dog expecting to be kicked. Every step the owner took was a hammer blow against the foundation of Preston's reality. The confident swagger he had possessed only moments before had evaporated, replaced by a stumbling, robotic gait. He could feel the eyes of the other staff on his back, their curiosity mixing with a dawning sense of confusion. He was no longer leading the procession. He was the last, pathetic straggler in a parade he didn't understand. James arrived at the small, wobbly table. The draft from the service corridor, the one Preston had used as a tool of passive aggression, ruffled the hem of his expensive suit jacket. He looked down at the young man sitting there, who was now smiling faintly, a look of quiet victory in his eyes. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath, the silence amplifying the moment. "Dad," Jaylen said, his voice perfectly clear, carrying easily in the suddenly quiet room. "You made it." James Carter placed a large, warm hand on Jaylen's shoulder, a gesture of immense pride and affection. The contact was a silent declaration to the entire room. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, son," James said, his voice filled with a warmth that was a stark contrast to the coldness he had shown Preston. He glanced around at the cramped, undesirable location, his eyes taking in the proximity to the clattering kitchen and the constant flow of staff. His smile didn't falter, but a new, harder glint appeared in his eyes. "Sorry, I'm a little late," he continued, his gaze returning to his son. "Had to finalize some paperwork for your birthday present." The word, "Dad," hit Preston like a physical blow. It was as if the sound itself had mass and velocity, slamming into his chest and knocking all the air from his lungs. His fawning, idiotic smile froze on his face, a grotesque rictus of horror. For a long second it remained there, a testament to his brain's inability to command his muscles. Then, it melted away, not slowly, but as if it had been splashed with acid, dripping down his face and leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pasty, sickly white, the color of spoiled milk. He looked from the powerful, smiling owner, Mr. James Carter, to the teenager in the hoodie, the loiterer, the freeloader he had just threatened to throw out onto the street. The dots, which had been a meaningless, scattered mess in his mind, suddenly connected with the sickening, violent speed of a lightning strike. The expensive limited edition sneakers that he hadn't recognized but had registered as out of place. The quiet, unnerving confidence the kid had displayed, a calm that had infuriated him. The patience, the endless, infuriating patience, as he sat at the worst table, enduring one insult after another without a single complaint. It all clicked into place, forming a perfect, horrifying picture of his own stupidity. The owner's son, the heir, the boy he had treated like garbage was the prince of the entire kingdom. The floor dropped out from under Preston's world. It was a dizzying, nauseating plunge into a black abyss of his own making. Every single moment of the past 30 minutes flashed through his mind in a rapid, brutal montage of self-incrimination. His dismissive glance at the door, the condescending wave to the hostess, the lie about the reserved booths, the long, deliberate minutes of ignoring him, the venomous glare he had shot at Leo, the busboy, the sarcastic, contemptuous question, "Are you still enjoying the view?" The stained, dog-eared menu dropped on the table like a piece of trash. And worst of all, his final, hateful whisper, the threat to throw him out, to cast him aside like a stray dog. Each memory was a fresh stab of a knife, twisting in his gut. He felt a wave of heat wash over his body, his skin prickling with a sweat that was instantly cold. He felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him, not just as a curious spectacle, but as a condemned man. He saw the busboy, Leo, standing near the kitchen entrance, his young face a complex mixture of fear, shock, and a tiny, undeniable flicker of righteous vindication. He had seen it all. And now he was seeing the fallout. Preston's gaze darted away, unable to bear it, and landed on Mrs. Gable. The elegant older woman was no longer watching with a neutral expression. Her face was now a mask of cool, knowing judgment, her eyes sharp and piercing, as if she were looking straight through his skin and into the rotten core of his character. She knew. She had known all along. He was completely, utterly, and irrevocably exposed. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He was trapped in the spotlight of his own catastrophic failure, a bug pinned to a board for all to see. His career, his ambitions, his entire fragile sense of self-worth, all writhing in their final, pathetic death throes. The restaurant, once a vibrant symphony of clinking cutlery, low chatter, and sizzling grills, was now utterly silent. The silence was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from shock, fear, and morbid curiosity. Every patron, every cook in the kitchen peering through the small circular windows of the swinging doors, every member of the waitstaff, was frozen in a tableau of suspended animation. It was a silence so profound that the gentle hum of the neon sign outside seemed to roar in the vacuum. James Carter did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He slowly turned his full attention from his son to the petrified waiter, and in that simple movement, he became the sole gravitational center of the room. His calm was a terrifying force, a placid lake surface that hinted at an unfathomable, crushing depth below. He looked at Preston, truly looked at him, and the waiter felt as though his very soul was being weighed, measured, and found wanting. "What's your name?" James asked. The question was spoken in a calm, almost conversational tone, yet it cracked through the silence like a whip. Preston's throat worked, but no sound emerged. He felt a strangled, dry clicking in his larynx. He swallowed, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Preston, sir," he finally stammered, the name a pathetic, trembling whisper. His own name sounded foreign on his lips, the name of a man he no longer recognized. "Preston," James repeated, letting the name hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. He tasted the syllables, examined them, and then discarded them as if they were of no consequence. "Preston, my son, Jaylen," he said, placing his hand back on Jaylen's shoulder, a simple gesture that was both an anchor for his son and a branding iron against Preston's conscience. "Has been sitting at this table for 35 minutes. He tells me that when he arrived, he was denied a proper table, despite several being available." James's eyes flickered for a split second towards the empty, pristine booths, then snapped back to Preston's face. "He tells me he was denied a menu until he specifically requested one, at which point he was given a stained and damaged copy. He then tells me that just a few moments ago, you threatened to throw him out of my restaurant for ordering a glass of water while he waited for his father. Is that an accurate summary of your service philosophy, Preston?" Preston's mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. Words were a foreign concept, his brain a chaotic storm of pure panic. He wanted to deny it, to lie, to beg, to explain, but his tongue was a leaden weight in his mouth. His entire body trembled, a violent, uncontrollable shudder that started in his knees and worked its way up his spine. James Carter did not wait for an answer that was clearly never going to come. He continued, his voice remaining perfectly level, a surgeon's scalpel dissecting Preston's career with cold precision. "I've also been taking a closer look at the weekly performance reports from this location," he said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming even more detached and analytical. "It's a fascinating read. It shows that service times in this specific section are, on average, 15% slower than in any other. It shows that customer complaints, though often minor and not officially filed, things like inattentive service or a long wait for the check, are disproportionately frequent right here." He paused, letting the data sink in, letting everyone in the room understand that this was not a rash, emotional decision. This was an execution based on evidence. He then glanced pointedly across the room, his eyes finding Mrs. Gable. The elegant woman, who had been watching the entire exchange with an unwavering gaze, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a small movement, but it was a powerful confirmation, a silent testimony from a valued, long-standing customer. The nod sealed Preston's fate. "The reports, and what I see with my own eyes," James continued, his gaze returning to bore and to Preston, paint a picture of an employee who spends more time and energy trying to impress what you think times are important customers than you do simply doing your job. You prioritize the appearance of wealth over the reality of service. You mistake a fancy suit for character and a designer hoodie for a lack of worth. That, Preston, is not the vision I have for this establishment. It is not the foundation upon which I built this company, and it is not a principle I will ever tolerate under my roof. Jaylen watched the entire scene unfold, not with the triumphant glee of a victor, but with a sober, chilling understanding of the moment. He saw the absolute, undeniable power his father wielded, a power that could create and destroy with a few calm words. But he also saw, for the first time with such clarity, the unbending principle that guided that power. This wasn't just a father defending his son. This wasn't petty revenge against a rude waiter. This was a course correction. It was a business lesson, raw and unfiltered, unfolding in real time. He was witnessing the practical application of every lecture his father had ever given him about integrity, respect, and the core values of their brand. He saw the weight of leadership, the heavy responsibility of upholding a standard, not just for oneself, but for every single person who wore the company uniform. In that moment, Jaylen felt the last of his teenage indignation melt away, replaced by the heavy mantle of his future. James Carter then did something no one expected. He turned away from the trembling, broken waiter and looked directly at his son, his expression softening with a profound sense of pride that was almost overwhelming. He raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting it so that every staff member, from the hostess at the front to the dishwashers in the back, could hear him clearly. "Jaylen," he announced, his voice resonating with authority and affection. "For your 17th birthday, I was going to offer you a summer internship, a chance to learn the ropes from the ground up." He paused, his eyes twinkling. "But watching you tonight, seeing the patience you've shown, the sharp observation in your eyes, the quiet dignity you maintained in the face of such blatant and calculated disrespect, you've proven to me that you're ready for much more." A collective gasp rippled through the staff. Preston looked as though he might genuinely faint, his eyes wide and vacant with shock. "Effective immediately," James Carter declared, his voice booming in the silent room. "I am promoting you to the position of Assistant General Manager of this location, with a specific focus on overseeing service quality and staff training." The shock in the room was palpable. It was a stunning, audacious move, a complete upending of the established hierarchy. Jaylen himself was momentarily speechless, his mind reeling from the sudden, immense weight of the title. Assistant General Manager. It was a real position, a position of authority, of responsibility. His father looked at him, a proud, challenging smile on his face. "Your training begins now, Jaylen," he said, his voice dropping back to a more personal level, though still loud enough for the nearest tables, and for Preston to hear. He gestured calmly with an open hand towards the trembling, ashen-faced waiter, who now seemed to shrink into himself, trying to become invisible. "Your first official duty as manager," James said, his eyes locking with his son's, "is to handle this personnel issue." He let the words settle, a heavy, final pronouncement. You decide his fate. All eyes in the Gilded Spoon, from the patrons frozen with forks in midair to the kitchen staff peering through the porthole windows, were fixed on Jaylen Carter. The air was thick with a tension that was almost a physical presence. He was no longer just a kid in a hoodie sitting at a bad table. He was the focal point of a drama that had brought the entire establishment to a standstill. He felt the immense weight of his father's words, "You decide his fate." It was a test, he knew, far more significant than the one he had been conducting on the waiter. This was a test of his own character, his own leadership. He could be cruel, he could gloat, he could savor the revenge that was being served to him on a silver platter. Or he could be something more. He could be a leader. Slowly, deliberately, Jaylen pushed his chair back and stood up. In that simple motion, his entire posture seemed to change. He was still 17, still wearing jeans and a hoodie, but he stood with an authority that mirrored his father's, a quiet confidence that made him seem taller, older, and infinitely more powerful than the trembling man before him. He looked directly at Preston, his gaze not filled with the hatred or contempt the waiter deserved, but with a calm, dispassionate finality. He was no longer a victim. He was a manager handling a personnel issue. Preston, Jaylen said, his voice steady and clear, carrying through the silent room with an unnerving lack of emotion. It was not the voice of an angry teenager, but the measured tone of an executive. My father, Mr. Carter, built this restaurant and this entire company on a single, unbreakable idea that everyone who walks through that door is a priority guest. Every single person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. It is the first thing you learn in training, and it is the last thing you are expected to forget. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the entire staff hear the principle being invoked. Today, you have shown that you either do not understand that core principle or you do not respect it. Either way, you have no place here. Preston's face, already a mask of horror, seemed to crumble further, the last vestiges of his composure dissolving into pure, abject despair. He opened his mouth, a desperate plea forming on his lips, but Jaylen gave him no opportunity to speak. Your employment at the Gilded Spoon is terminated, effective immediately, Jaylen stated, the words as sharp and clean as a guillotine's blade. Please go to the back office, where someone will supervise you as you collect your personal belongings. I will personally ensure that your final paycheck is processed and delivered by the end of the day. The finality was absolute. There was no room for argument, no possibility of appeal. It was over. The sentence had been passed, and the execution was swift and clinical. Preston, utterly and completely defeated, gave a single, jerky nod, his body moving like a puppet with its strings cut. He didn't dare look at Jaylen or at James Carter. He turned, his shoulders slumped, his confident swagger replaced by a pathetic, shuffling gait. He began his walk of shame, a long, lonely journey across the checkered floor that now felt like a mile of broken glass. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet the gaze of his former colleagues, who averted their eyes as he passed. Some looked down at their shoes, some turned to wipe already clean tables, a few just stared into the middle distance. It was a collective shunning, a silent agreement to erase him from their reality. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale, his career at the Gilded Spoon over in a flash of arrogant misjudgment. As he pushed through the swinging doors to the back, the doors swung shut behind him, closing a chapter with a soft final whoosh. The tension in the room did not immediately dissipate, it simply transformed. The fear and morbid curiosity directed at Preston now shifted to Jaylen, a mixture of awe, apprehension, and a dawning respect. He was the new power, the new standard. Jaylen let the silence hold for a moment longer, then he turned his attention to the rest of the staff, who were watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. He addressed them clearly, his voice still firm but now carrying a different note, not of judgment, but of leadership. Let what just happened be a lesson to everyone, he said, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of the hostess, the other waiters, the bartenders. We will not tolerate disrespect in this establishment, not to our guests, and not to each other. From this moment on, the only thing that determines your priority is doing your job with excellence and integrity. His eyes then found Leo, the young busboy, who was still standing near the kitchen entrance, looking as if he wanted to melt into the floor. Leo, Jaylen said, his voice softening slightly. Leo looked up, his eyes wide with shock that the new assistant general manager even knew his name. I saw you, Jaylen continued, a small, encouraging smile touching his lips. I saw you try to do the right thing. Thank you. Leo's face flooded with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. He could only manage a stunned nod, but in that moment, a powerful message was sent to every other employee. The new boss saw everything, not just the mistakes, but the good intentions too. A new standard had been set, not just of punishment, but of reward and recognition. The fear in the room began to recede, replaced by a new, fragile energy of hope and possibility. James Carter, who had watched the entire exchange with a quiet, immense pride, stepped forward and placed his hand on Jaylen's back. Come on, son, he said softly. Let's get you that birthday meal. He led Jaylen away from the dismal corner table, walking him past the stunned patrons and staff, towards the front of the restaurant. He led him to the very best booth in the house, the plush, semicircular throne that Preston had so desperately tried to give him earlier. As they slid into the soft leather seats, the life of the diner slowly, hesitantly, began to resume. Conversation started up again, hushed at first, then gradually returning to their normal volume. The clinking of silverware resumed. The sizzle from the kitchen seemed less jarring. It was the same restaurant, but the atmosphere had been irrevocably altered. A quiet revolution had taken place. James looked at his son, his eyes shining with an emotion that went far beyond simple pride. "That was more than just a birthday gift, Jaylen," he said, his voice low and earnest. "It was a test of your character. I could have stepped in and fired him myself the moment I walked in, but I needed to see what you would do. I needed to see if you had the strength to lead, not just the name to inherit." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "You didn't just pass the test, son. You set the curve. You were fair, you were decisive, and you were principled. You didn't make it personal. You made it about the business, about our values. That's leadership." He leaned back, a broad, satisfied smile spreading across his face. "The gilded spoon, and one day, the entire company, is your legacy to shape. I have no doubt you'll make it better." He picked up a pristine, leather-bound menu, the kind Preston had denied his son, and slid it across the table. "Now, let's get you something to eat. You've more than earned it." The story concluded with the father and son sitting together, their heads bent over the menus. But they weren't just discussing what to order. They were talking about the future. Jaylen, now a young man who had stepped fully into his power, was already making suggestions, talking about new training modules, about a system to reward employees like Leo, about ways to ensure that the customer experience was flawless from the moment someone walked in the door, regardless of what they wore. He looked out across the dining room, the restaurant that was now, in a very real sense, his responsibility. His reflection shone back at him from the large window overlooking the street. It showed a teenager in a hoodie, yes, but it also showed something more. It showed a leader. The clickbait promise had been fulfilled. The arrogant waiter had been served his just desserts, and the story concluded not just on a note of earned triumph, but on the quiet, powerful promise of a new beginning.